Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is so great to see so many people here interested in finding out about grants. If you could introduce yourself in the chat, we always love to know who's in the room. So just put your name, your organization, and your favorite color. We're going to go ahead and start because we love people who are on time and we have a lot to get through. So thank you for being here. My name is Petra Sultan. I am the Director of Advocacy and Education for Thrive, the Alliance of Nonprofits for San Mateo County. And with me, I have Georgia Farouk, the Executive Director, and Yahaira Ortega, who's our Policy Associate. In addition, of course, we have our special guest who I will introduce in a moment. But first, I want to do a little bit of some information for you that I think you might be interested in about Thrive. So on the next slide, a lot of you know Thrive, but for those of you who don't, I just want to give you a quick update that we are an organization that strengthens people and we strengthen communities and we strengthen organizations through policy and advocacy, cross-sector collaboration, and nonprofit capacity building. We have a lot of programs going on right now. On the next slide, here's just some examples of things that we're working on, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight a couple of things that are coming up soon. So in addition to this, to what you're here for, which is to learn about the California relief grants, next week on September 22nd, we're also doing an event around other funding. So California has created a new portal to find out about grants on a statewide level, because I'm sure a lot of you know that finding grants, even in the first place, is often really difficult. And so this grants portal that they've created makes it very simple. So we're going to do a training on that, and you're all welcome to sign up for it. Yahaira will put in the chat on the event page where you can find information about that. In addition, we are doing a environment and sustainability group meeting, and we're going to be talking about kind of a big picture. What are collective climate goals that we want for San Mateo County, including climate justice? And we don't just want input from our groups that are working directly in environment and sustainability. We also want input from all of you. So there's actually a one question survey. What is your most important climate change and climate justice question? And concern. And we would love for you to fill out that survey. So we have a very broad sector of answers from that. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is redistricting. A lot of us spent time working on census, and the purpose of that, one of the purposes, was so that we would have accurate political representation. And now that we're actually going to be doing the redistricting, changing the lines for how we vote, now's the opportunity to talk about your community of interest. Who do you think really needs to be together in order to have the political power, the political voice that they deserve? So there's a lot of information on our website about that. And in addition, on this Saturday, the county is having a meeting that you are all welcome to. And like I said, all the information is on our redistricting webpage, but please, if you have any questions, reach out either to me or to Yahaira, and we would love to talk about it a lot. Very important stuff. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide. So these are some more of the other things we're working on. And here we are to the main event. So we really want to thank CalNonprofits and their partnership in getting this important information out. And I have to let you know that I just came from another meeting where Sue received high compliments from an organization that she helped them apply for this grant, and they got it. So this is there's a nonprofit success story already to kick us off with this meeting. And like I said, we really appreciate CalNonprofit's partnership to really get the word out to our nonprofits, because sometimes we don't think of ourselves as small businesses, but we really are, and we deserve relief as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Sue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Petra, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and talking about how to apply to the California Relief Grant Program. We'll also touch on some things for those questions that might come up for people who have already applied, so I hope everybody will stay with us. Next slide, please. Petra, we'd love to hear about nonprofit organizations engaging in advocacy. CalNonprofits is a statewide membership organization and policy alliance for nonprofit organizations in California with over 10,000 nonprofit organization members. And you'll see a photo there of Jan Masaoka, our CEO, and it was her advocacy that brought us to this place today. The California Relief Grant Program was created by the state legislature in response to the needs of nonprofits and small businesses who are operating during COVID times. And originally, this program was intended only for small business. CalNonprofit's advocacy allowed nonprofits to qualify for these funds as well. And to date, over 7,000 nonprofit organizations have received grants of between $5,000 and $25,000. And so, as we mentioned, we're a policy alliance. We advocate on state issues that pertain to nonprofits. And we're going to talk about program partners when we get around to the application. You can choose CalNonprofits as your partner in this application or any other organization. We are here to assist you no matter what. And you'll see our website and my contact information, my email on the footer on many of these slides. I am available by phone and I am available by email, and we'll put up my phone number a little later on too. And we're here to help as many nonprofits be successful in this process as possible. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I am always available to answer your questions. So there is my phone number and my email address, and you'll see this again at the end of the webinar. Before we advance the slide, I'll also mention that the state of California appropriated $4.5 billion to this program. And the way that it's been administered has been in 9 different what they call rounds, which are application periods. And the state chose the California Office of the Small Business Advocate as the administering agency, who selected Lendistry as the private industry partner, which built the website and is administering the grant program. We at CalNonprofits don't have any influence over who is selected for a grant, but we can answer most of your questions or issues if you come up against those while you're filling out your application or while you are, or after you apply and you have questions. Next slide, please. One of the things we want to be sure to make sure that everybody is aware of is that unfortunately there are some scam artists and fraudsters out there. To avoid interacting with them, please remember that applying for this program is completely free. If you're asked to pay for anything, that's a scam. The communications that you'll receive after you start your application will come from Lendistry.com. And if you want more information from Lendistry, their website is at careliefgrant.com. There are some copycat websites out there with a slightly different spelling or a .org suffix. And please don't interact with those, only with Lendistry.com or careliefgrant.com. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we have multiple funding rounds happening, and I want to talk about the 2 that are open right now. Both are open for applications through September 30th at 5 p.m. Round 8 is for select arts and cultural organizations. And I want everybody to know that if you go to our website at calnonprofits.org, on the top right, you'll see a blue box that has that you can click on to get to our application guide and frequently asked questions. If you're wondering if you qualify for round 8, that's addressed in our FAQs. And the FAQs are designed to be a companion to you right next to your computer as you're applying for this grant. It easily organizes the information about what documents and information you need to gather, how to apply for the grant. And there are many questions on the grant that are not intuitive or typical for nonprofit organizations. And so it will give you all the information about how to answer those questions, and then also how to log back in and check your status whenever you'd like after you've applied. So for round 8 is for certain types of arts and cultural organizations. And if you qualify in round 8, we do encourage those organizations to place your application in round 8 before September 30th at 5 p.m. Next slide, please. Round 9, on the other hand, is also open until September 30th. And nonprofit organizations and small businesses can apply in this round. And I want to note that there are 2 different application links for round 8 and for round 9, and those are both available in the FAQs on our website. In round 9, there's $500 million available. And if you think about grants of between $5,000 and $25,000, that means that there's an awful lot of grants available. And we have seen many nonprofit organizations getting funding, and we do think there is a good chance for nonprofits when you apply in either one of these rounds. I'll note that this program has already been extended twice by the state, and we do expect that round 9 will be the last opportunity to apply for one of these grants. Next question, or next slide, please. If you applied in an earlier round and you'd like to know where you stand, you can log back into your application, as I mentioned a moment ago, anytime you like, and the instructions for that are in the FAQs on our website. I'll also mention that no matter if you already applied, no matter what round you applied in, you can only receive 1 grant from this program. And if you previously applied and you've been waitlisted, every waitlisted application rolls over automatically to the next eligible round and is considered there. So if you're on the waitlist, there's no need to reapply in round 8 or 9. Next question, or next slide, please. I mentioned that you can potentially qualify for a grant of $5,000 to $25,000, and this is a drop-down menu from the application where you'll be asked how much do you want to apply for. This grant is very different from typical nonprofit grant processes in the respect that typically we look ahead to what we're planning to do and asked for funding for our future activities. In this case, this is looking backward and saying, we know that many small businesses and nonprofits struggle to stay open during COVID. And so these funds are intended to, air quotes, reimburse you for expenses that you had in prior years. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. But what qualifies you for the grant is what you reported on your 2019 Form 990. They'll look at your gross revenue, and if that falls between $1,000 and $100,000, you're eligible for a $5,000 grant. If it's between $100,000 and $1 million, you're eligible for a $15,000 grant. And if it's $1 million to $2.5 million, you're eligible for a $25,000 grant. With one caveat, round 8 does not have that maximum $2.5 million cap. And so if you're a qualifying arts and cultural organization, no matter what your size, as long as you had at least $1,000 in gross revenue showing on your 2019 Form 990, you can qualify for a grant. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit more about eligibility. And eligible nonprofit organizations are those that are organized under IRS Code Section 501c3, C6, or C19. You can be a corporation, an unincorporated association, or a cooperative. I mentioned a moment ago that you need to have a 990 tax return filed for 2019 with a California address. We recognize that some organizations operate in multiple states, but your 990 does need to show a California address. You have to have annual revenues in the range I just described. And I want to mention for those folks that might file the shorter forms of the 990, like the postcard, that does not show your annual revenue. And so you need a little additional documentation that's easy to obtain. And that is described in our FAQs. So you also have to have been in operation prior to June 1, 2019. My slide says on or before, and the guidance was just clarified this morning. moved back a day to May 31st. You have to be in operation prior to June 1, 2019, even if you didn't incorporate or get your 501c status until after that date. Organizations who might have done their formal and legal organization later on can still qualify if they can prove that they were operating services and programs prior to June 1st, 2019. You have to provide a physical address in California. Post office boxes are not accepted, and that is for verification of identity. As Lendistry processes the application, they do vigorous identity and location verification in order to prevent any fraud in the program. You have to have remained open during COVID times, or if you were forced to shutter, you need to have a plan for reopening. And you had to have at least $1 in qualifying expenses for the period of March 1st to December 31st, 2020. And I'm going to talk more about what qualifying expenses are in a moment. Next slide, please. Those ineligible organizations would be those that are departments or programs of a parent agency. So think a department of a university, or sometimes in nonprofits, our programs apply individually. Any nonprofit organization can only receive one grant for the organization as it appears on their 990 form. Unfortunately, fiscally sponsored organizations are not eligible for this program because the 2019 990 is required and they do not file a separate 990. And there are some very narrow and specific rules for religious institutions that operate programs in the community. And you can find out more about that on the FAQs on our CalNonprofit's website. Next slide, please. Other requirements are that the person you name as the applicant in your application must appear on the statement of information that the nonprofit files with the California Secretary of State's office. If you're familiar with that form, you know that there's two places on there that you list people's names. One is you have to provide the names of 3 principals for your organization. Typically, those are board members and or the CEO. And then you also name your agent for service. The named applicant must be one of those 3 principals. They can also be the agent for service, but they can't only be listed as the agent for service. And I've also touched on that form 990 from 2019. The reason I speak about it so much is it's a firm requirement and there are no exceptions. Next slide, please. And we're going to stop and turn to Yahira for a moment to see if we have any questions in the chat box.
There are no questions in the chat box, but anyone that has a question, feel free to unmute.
Okay, we're going to have another opportunity for questions later on, so don't hesitate to put those in the chat box. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really important whenever you're accessing the relief grant application is to make sure that you're working in Google Chrome as your browser, whether that's at the time that you initially apply or any time that you return to check your status. If you're using other browsers like Firefox or Internet Explorer, the application will tend to either freeze or return errors. And there's a few more tech tips included in the FAQs on our website. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about how do you prepare to fill out your application. And the first thing you want to do is gather your documents, that 2019 Form 990 and any additional revenue documentation if you file the postcard. You'll need your articles of incorporation, and the named applicant will need to provide a photo ID issued by a government agency. Think of something like a license or a passport. And there is something called the application certification form that you download either from the careliefgrant.com website, or there's a link to it in our FAQs. You fill that out and then you'll upload it as one of the required attachments. Some people confuse the application certification form with the application itself, but we'll note that the application itself is filled out completely online, and that application certification form is a required attachment. The other things that are listed here are under if applicable. If you have them, you can provide them. If you don't have them or they're not required of you, don't worry about it. The first one that's listed is your state RRF1 or other income documentation. That is for those folks that file the short forms of the 990, which don't list your gross revenue. And so you have to provide that additional documentation. There's a link on the FAQs to how you can check your form RRF if need be. And then if you have a certificate of organization, a fictitious name registration, which is also known as a DBA or doing business as, or a government issued business license, you'd want to provide those. An example of a government issued business license would be, I serve on a board of directors with a community music center in Berkeley, and and Berkeley requires us to have a business license. So that's an example. Not everybody will have one. Next slide, please. The next bit of information you want to gather is your gross revenue from 2019. As we saw earlier, that will determine your overall eligibility for the grant and also the grant amount that you might be eligible for. Also, this grant is particularly intended for folks that were impacted by operating during COVID times. And so they will ask you for your gross revenue from April 1 to September 30th in 2019, and for the same time period in 2020. That is for purposes of determining the impact of COVID on your organization. A note about your figures from 2020. You will want to provide your gross income less any government COVID relief that you have received. So that might be things like the Payroll Protection Program, PPP, or EIDL from the federal government. And some counties and cities have their own COVID relief programs as well. The reason that you'll separate out those numbers is because you'll be asked to provide them in a different question on the application. Next slide, please. I mentioned that I'd be reviewing qualifying expenses, and this is a little confusing for some folks. But the thing I want to highlight is if you have even $1 in qualifying expenses for the period of March 1st through December 31st, 2020, then that qualifies you to apply, to meet that requirement for the grant and to apply. And so during that period, March 1 to December 31st, 2020, qualifying expenses would be your regular operating or occupancy expenses like rent, mortgage, utilities, insurance, payroll, etc. Any expenses that were related to operating during COVID times. So for example, if you had to buy hand sanitizer or personal protective equipment or any equipment related to continuing to operate in the COVID environment. If you had to switch your programs to an online environment and had Zoom costs, for example, those are all qualifying expenses. And the reason I say that you need only $1 in qualifying expenses is because you'll note that there's not a one-to-one relationship between the grant amount and your expenses. The grant amounts are preset, and so they're not intended to fund this specific thing that you paid for in 2020. If you receive a grant, you don't need to go back and open up your books and apply it to specific expenses. You can treat it as general operating funds. The only caveat here is no double dipping, which means that if you have already had that expense paid by another grant source, whether government or private, of course, that would not be a qualifying expense for this grant program. We all know, I think, if we're experienced grant writers, that you can only charge an expense once to an individual funder. Next slide, please. To start your application, there are two places that you can go. One is the careliefgrant.com website, and that is for both nonprofits and small businesses. There's a wealth of information there, an overwhelming amount of information to my point of view, which is why we recommend looking at the FAQs on our website first. And what you'll notice is that when you are going to start an application on the terminology that Lendistry uses is that you have to choose a partner. Ordinarily, when we think about partnering with another organization, it involves program planning and working together, but that's not the way partner is used as a term in this program. Your application partner provides you with a portal to start your application, and also is there for advice and answer questions and help you get your application placed, and also answer any questions after your application has been placed. CalNonprofits has been selected as an application partner, and the address that you see there is where you would go to start an application with CalNonprofits as your partner. You don't need to copy that down today. It's also in the FAQs on our website. And now I'm going to move on to what does the application look like and how to answer some of the questions it contains. Next slide, please. When you log in through your partner portal, you'll notice that there's two sides, and some people get confused because we're used to setting up an account before we try to interact with a website, but that's not how it works here. If you're going to the website for the first time, you click that purple box on the left that says click here to apply. When you return to your application, if you need to complete it or upload additional documents, or you just want to check your status, that's when you will go to the side that says existing customers sign into your account. You become an existing customer with Lendistry the moment that you provide an email address in an application, whether it is completed at that time or not. And you can only type in an email address once, and it will continue to recognize that email address in the system, even if you don't complete that application. If for any reason you need to start a second application, you need to provide a fresh new email address with every application that you start. And we'll note, we noted earlier that any organization can only receive one grant from this program, but there have been reasons of technical difficulties and other situations that have caused people to need to start more than one application. And once you provide that email address in the application that you start, you're going to receive an email from Lendistry with a temporary password and a link to return to your application. Please store that someplace where you can access it easily in the future, because you'll use it to return to your application anytime you like. And when you log in the first time after receiving that password email, you'll be given the option to create a password of your own. Next slide, please. After you click on click here to apply, you will see you'll be taken to the application portal. And I want to be very specific to say that some people don't notice that there's more than one application available in the portals. Every portal contains both an application for nonprofits and an application for small businesses. The small businesses will say grant program for for-profits, and the nonprofit application starts where that red arrow is pointing to that black bar that says grant program for nonprofits. It's grayed out on my example here, but looking down below, when you go in, that button that says apply now is where you'll click on to start your application. And I have a note for people who may have applied back in rounds 1 or round 2. The portals had a different design then, and it was very difficult to see that there were 2 applications to choose from. Consequently, many people chose the wrong application. Lendistry cannot process applications that are provided by nonprofits on the small business form or vice versa, and they can't convert a form to one to the other. If you are on the waiting list from rounds 1 and 2, I highly suggest that you go back in and check your application status, and the code that's on your application status will tell you what you applied for, and we're going to look at that also in a moment. Next slide, please. As you're starting your application, you'll see that every page of the application has a button on the top for accessibility features if you need that. And also the first page will say select a language. The application is available in many languages, and the drop-down menu that you see here is not inclusive. Lendistry recently added support in additional languages as well. I think there's 25 or 30 languages that the application is available in. Next slide, please. One of the things that I also want to note, as you move through the application, at the end, you will not be given an opportunity to print out or otherwise save your work. And once you hit submit on this application, you also can't go back and view your application. So if you want to save your work, we recommend taking a screenshot of each page. What you see up right now is the first page of the application. And on that top right, there's a red arrow pointing to watch video. And you can click on that and see a video of how to fill out your application if you like. And on the bottom in the center there, we've got another red arrow pointing to one of the questions. As I mentioned earlier, this application is kind of nonprofit unfriendly. It uses some terminology and asks some questions that we're not familiar with in general on funding applications. And that arrow is pointing to a question. And then you'll also see up above at the top title, it says owner details. Lendistry knows that nonprofits don't have owners. And so it should say authorized representative. If it says something else where you enter the applicant name, you want to double check that you're not on the small business form. But down below, it will say what is the percentage of ownership for the applicant? Again, Lendistry knows that nonprofits don't have owners, and you can answer 0% in that box. Excuse me. Once again, all of these questions are listed on our FAQs. So you can take a look at that anytime you like as to how to answer some of these questions that are unfamiliar. Next slide, please. Here, the red arrow is pointing to a drop-down menu on one of the questions that asks, does your organization fall under one of the 4 priority service areas? Those priority services are emergency food, emergency housing, childcare, and workforce development. Workforce development is if you assist people in getting jobs or train people so that they can get a job or a better one than they have now. You do not need to be under the 4 priorities in order to qualify for a grant. So if your programs and services don't fall under there, you can simply click other. Another note that I want to make is that you have to fill in every single question or you will not be able to submit your application. Every question has to have an answer to it. There might be places where the drop-down menus don't really seem to apply to you, but you have to choose the thing that's closest because you have to choose something so that you can continue to move through the application. Lendistry knows that nonprofits don't fit neatly into some of the choices that are available to you. Next slide, please. One of the other things that you'll see is that you will be asked some questions about your employees. And one of the things that we want to note is you'll be asked to give an employee headcount expressed in full-time equivalents. I think those are familiar to most people as FTEs. Do not include your independent contractors in your FTE headcount. The reason for that is that they can apply on their own as small businesses. You'll also be asked what were the number of jobs that you retained and what were the number of jobs created. Jobs retained are the number of employees that you had on December 31st, 2020. And jobs created is the number of new jobs that you created in 2020, if any, and the number of people recalled from layoff during 2020. Next slide, please. And here we've got a bunch of arrows pointing to some questions I want to highlight. That first one pointing down on the top left points to a question that says, who is your customer base? Is it B2B, B2C, or both? B2B stands for business to business. B2C stands for business to consumer. Most nonprofit organizations are providing services directly to consumers. So most nonprofit organizations are B2C. If you're providing support to, say, other nonprofit organizations or businesses, then you would be B2B. On the left there are, again, some of those drop-down menus. I'm sorry, on the right, those two arrows at the top are pointing to two questions that folks typically find the drop-down menus you may not fit neatly into those categories. Again, it's okay to say unknown. It's okay to say no to the questions. Many of these questions are for data gathering purposes and not for determining your eligibility. So answer all the questions to the best of your ability so that you can continue to move through the application. On the left side there, that second arrow is pointing to something that asks you for your NAICS code or your NAICS code. NAICS stands for the North American Industrial Classification System. And many nonprofits are unfamiliar with that unless you've done government contracting or unless you're a larger nonprofit that files certain schedules with your 990 that requires you to list your NAICS code. The NAICS code is required for this application, and it is particularly applicable for those people who are arts and cultural organizations that want to qualify for round 8. A list of the qualifications are by NAICS code, and a list of the qualifying codes are included in our FAQs. If you've never seen this before or you don't know what your NAICS code is, then moving across the screen to the right, there's a button that says click here to find your NAICS code. That will take you to a website where you enter in some keywords. It will give you suggestions, and then you can choose the one that most closely fits your organization. Alternately, in our FAQs, we list a service from the US Census Bureau called Dr. NAICS, and you can either call or email them and they will help you find your NAICS code. I understand that they are very responsive. Also, if you're a multi-service agency, it may be difficult to choose just one NAICS code because you might have services that fall under different ones. In that case, we recommend that you do contact Dr. NAICS and let them help you choose the right NAICS code. Next slide, please. Now we're getting to the last page of the application. On the top left, that first arrow points to a question that says that is a restatement of the 4 priorities, and we'll also ask you if 51% or more of your clients fall into the low and middle income categories. You don't need to have specific statistics. You can make your best estimate there, and then that middle arrow is pointing to the place where you will enter in those revenue figures that I was talking about earlier from that 6-month period in 2019 and that 6-month period in 2020. And then down below, the arrow is pointing to the 2 pink lines, which are where you would enter in any government-sponsored COVID assistance that you've received. Let's go back to that slide for a moment. And the way to fill this out, as I mentioned earlier, is that when you provide your figures for 2020, you don't want to include any government-sponsored COVID assistance because this is where you'll enter it on the application. The application has a drop-down menu that asks what program did you get it from, and you have to choose the one that you got the largest grant from. If you have more than one grant, then you want to create a Word document and just list out your sources and the amount you receive and upload that into any document category. And that second question will ask how much you received. If you received multiple grants, put the total in that box. Thank you. Let's move to the next slide. Here we are coming toward the end of the application, and you'll see a pop-up that may ask you to type in yes or choose from a drop-down menu that says yes, depending on what version of the application you're on. And it will ask you to review that. It will tell you you are filling out the arts and cultural nonprofit application, or you are filling out the small business or the nonprofit application. So it's an opportunity to double check that you filled out the right form. If you find you're on the wrong form, you have to close out of this application completely, start all over again, and provide a different email address than you provided in the incomplete application. As I mentioned, those remain in the system, and you don't want to be flagged as providing a duplicate application. There's also an opportunity here to save and continue later. So if you haven't finished all the questions, or you're not quite ready to submit, you can save your work, log out, and return later on. Next slide, please. Once you've typed yes and you're ready to submit your application, this is the button that you'll see. Again, once you click submit, you'll not be able to return to your application questions or to view them again. So you want to save those screenshots. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, what happens next is that you'll get that email from Lendistry with your temporary password. You log back in and set your own password, and you'll see a status message. We're going to review that in just a moment. Then you'll go on to upload your documents. You'll need your required documents in electronic format. And when you log back in, you'll see a button that says upload documents. And then you'll see a screen that lists the document categories with a button next to each one that you can click to go ahead and upload. Lendistry requests that you do put the proper documents in the correct categories, but don't worry, if you put them in the wrong category, they'll fix it for you when they're processing your application. Then go on to choose, then if you have any documents that are too large to upload, there is a 15 megabyte limit on documents. If your document exceeds that, you have a choice. You can either compress the document if you know how to do that, or you can split it into two and label it clearly. For example, 990 part 1 and 990 part 2. I want to talk for a moment about banking information, because this is something that is very unusual for nonprofits to be requested. If you do, if your funders provide funds directly to your bank account, typically they ask for a wire transfer number. In this case, you are going to be asked to provide your banking number and your login credentials. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that, but it is required for the grant. Your banking credentials will not be visible to Lendistry. They go directly to a company called Plaid, which provides secure transaction services for large companies like Visa. And again, people ask me, do I absolutely have to do that? You do have to do that if you want to receive a grant. And I want to mention something else in the application, which is the named applicant will also be asked to provide their personal data in the form of social security number and date of birth. Again, that is an unusual request for nonprofit organizations, and we're all trained to protect our personal data to avoid consequences. However, Lendistry does rigorous identification for identity, and as I mentioned earlier, for a physical address associated with the application, and those the personal information for the applicant is required. They will do what's called a soft credit check, which does not impact an individual's application, but is strictly for verification of identity. Next slide, please. After you've started an application, when you log back in, this is what your status is going to look like. And I mentioned a moment ago, prior applicants should be sure to log in and see that you filled out the application that you intended to, especially if you applied way back in the beginning of the year or even the end of last year in rounds 1 or round 2, when it was difficult to tell that there were 2 applications in the portal. There's a code there that will say either CRG, which means a small business application, a CRG NPO, which means you filled out the nonprofit application, and the CRG AC NPO is for the arts and cultural rounds. That was round 4, and that was and that's round 8, which is open now. Going on to our next slide, these are the possible statuses that you might see when you check your status message in red. If your application is incomplete, you can go ahead and click the button to complete your application. If it says awaiting selection process or on the waiting list, there is no need to reapply. Your application will automatically roll over to consideration in round 9. And Lendistry also uses some strange terminology for us, and the next status will say selected pending validations. That doesn't mean your application was selected for funding. It means it was selected for processing, and they are verifying your information. When all of that has been verified, two things are going to happen. First, you're going to receive by email a grant agreement from DocuSign. That grant agreement will be live for 3 days. So once you sign the grant agreement, you will move to funding. If you miss that email for any reason and 3 days have passed, you simply need to call Lendistry and ask them to resend it. They will do that. And that's what the status means in closing, and docs out pending means that they've sent out your grant agreement and they're waiting for you to return it. And then you move to funding. A note about that banking information that I mentioned moments ago, you don't need to provide that at the time of application. You can monitor your status and provide it when you see that status change to in closing, docs out, pending for funding. Another thing I want to note that I neglected to mention earlier is that if you get through part 1 of the application, which is where you're entering your information and choosing from the drop-down menus, and you do that prior to September 30th at 5 p.m., you've made an on-time submission. If you need more time to gather your documents and provide them, you can go back in after the deadline and upload documents. If anything is missing, Lendistry will contact you while they are processing your application, but it is in your best interest to provide your attachments and your uploads as soon as possible because it will speed Lendistry in processing your application. Okay, we are getting to the end of our presentation, and I want to make sure there's time for questions. So we're going to do that now. Next slide. And why don't we go ahead and put the next slide up while we're looking at questions?
Awesome. So we have only 2 questions in the chat. And the first one says, does other governmental awards like PPP reduce the gross receipts that qualify for Cal relief grants?
It does not. It is information gathering. It does not reduce your grant amount. And I also want to stress that this is a grant, not a loan or a forgivable loan. It's just a grant.
And the second question was, are people of the audience receiving a follow-up email? And I will send this all to you all with the recording and anything else, and you can reach out if you have any questions. I'll put my email in the chat again. And that's all we have to do.
Great, and we can move to the next slide, which is all the contact information that you need. Again, this is all available on the FAQs on our website. I really encourage nonprofit applicants to read through that document before you attempt the application. It'll make it much more quick and easy for you. We estimate that if you've taken the time to read through the FAQs and you've gathered your documents and you've got the information that will be asked for, that you can get through filling out this application online in under an hour. And I thought I saw another chat come in. Do we have another question?
Yes, we have one more. And it says, do we need to actively check the status page, or do they push out a notification to alert us of their status?
You need to check your status page. And in particular, Lendistry does not always send out notifications when you've been funded. So I recommend that people check their status frequently.
Right.
I saw that. How frequently? You know, if I were doing it, I would check probably once a week, certainly not every day.
Awesome. There's one last question. If my agency gross revenue is above 2.5 million, can my agency still apply?
The answer is, if you are one of the arts and cultural organizations that are among the Naics codes that are approved for round 8, then the answer is yes, you would apply in round 8 for the arts and cultural round. If you are a nonprofit doing other types of services, you'd want to make sure you're looking at your 2019 gross revenue, but if that is above 2.5 million, unfortunately, you wouldn't qualify. Another note I want to be sure is that there are 2 different application links for round 8 and round 9. So you want to make sure you know which one you're applying for and use the appropriate link. And again, that's in our FAQs.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sue, for all your help. And I think we have another question that says,
Sure.
my organization supports a school in another country, Myanmar. Its teachers evacuated to the US in COVID, and we paid them here as independent contractors. Would we qualify for this program?
The answer is that if you are incorporated as a 501c3, C6, or C19 organization, and you have your Form 990 from 2019 that shows a California address, it really doesn't matter what your program is. The state assumes that virtually all nonprofits and small businesses were impacted by COVID. And so there is no narrative on this application, as we've seen. You don't have to write anything. If you meet the minimum qualifications, then you are eligible for a grant.
Any other questions while we have the expert here? I'll give it a minute, but in the meantime, I want to thank you so much, Sue, for all this information. I'm very happy that people were able to gather here and learn about this grant opportunity. Thank you for your time. I'm going to stop the sharing and stop the recording.
Okay, I want to thank you very much for having us and being a partner with CalNonprofits in this work. And once again, please feel free to contact me by email or by phone. I actually do answer my phone in real time, and I'd be happy to talk with you.